Welcome to the 2022 World Rapid Championship, a tournament that brings together players of the highest caliber from all over the world. Today, we're going to look at the round 2 game between world champion Magnus Carlsen and the leader of the chess bros himself, Hansen. The game started off with b3 by Magnus, Eric played d5 in response, and Magnus played bishop b2. Now, here black has a few options, but Eric chose to play the move bishop g4, which basically prevents white from playing e3 in this position because of the pin on the pawn. It also indicates to white that if they play something like knight f3 in this position, bishop takes f3 would be a consideration either then or in the future. Here, Magnus played the move f3, and a lot of people say that in the opening you should never move your f-pawn, but I think we can make an exception for the world champion. Black responded with bishop to f5, and here Magnus played the move e4. Now, e4 is already an extremely rare move. Normally people play the move e3 in this position, just trying to develop normally after all of this. However, Magnus chose to play much more aggressively with e4, and the idea was that if Eric had taken the pawn with d takes e4, commentators were saying that probably the likely move would have been knight c3, because you want to basically gambit the pawn and try and get initiative if you're white here. However, Eric did not take the pawn. Instead, he played the move bishop g6 in this position, saying that, alright, I'm not going to accept this strange sacrifice because I'm not really sure what Magnus could have potentially prepared. So after this slightly strange opening and then this weird inclusion of f3 and e4, you think that Magnus would now resort to traditional chess and make some more normal moves, but he says no and chooses to play h4. h4 introduces the threat of h5, trapping the bishop, so Eric responds by playing h5 himself. E takes d5 was played by Magnus, queen takes d5, simply recapturing the pawn, and knight c3 was played. Black moves the queen back with queen d6, queen e2 was played, so introducing the threat of queen b5 check, which could potentially attack the b7 pawn in the future. Now, note that this position is just very strange. White's about to castle long, they've got their queen on e2, the pawn on h4, and a pawn on f3, so it's definitely an opening position that you wouldn't see in a classical game unless it was prepared for a long time. But after queen e2, black played the move knight c6. Note that instead of knight c6, if you had taken the pawn on c2, which seems like a free pawn at first, white would be winning because of the move d3 in this position. d3 basically locks this bishop in, and there's really no way to save it, so after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, Magnus would be up a piece and completely winning. Thus, Eric decided to go knight c6 instead, trying to go knight d4 in this position, which would be a very real threat. So after knight c6, Magnus actually castled queenside in this position, which opened up a ton of tactical possibilities for both sides. The first tactic that immediately comes to mind is the move bishop takes c2. The point is, if you take on c2 with the king, then knight d4 check would fork the king and the queen, and black would come out on top. However, after bishop takes c2, Magnus would not have taken this bishop. He would have played the move knight b5, attacking this queen. More importantly, if you take this queen, it comes with check. So a move like bishop takes d1 would not be good for black because now you take the queen, and there's no time to take the queen on e2 because it's check. And after something like c takes d6, Magnus would have just recaptured this bishop and he would be up a ton of material. Instead of bishop takes d1, after knight b5, black had tried the move queen c5, but after queen c5, white has the move queen c4. And now you see that white has some threats of their own. Although black has taken this pawn and is now attacking this d1 rook, white is threatening to go knight takes c7. A sample line here would be something like queen takes c4, bishop takes c4, bishop takes d1, knight takes c7, king d7 attacking this knight takes a8, and here you see that black has won a rook and white has won a rook. However, the bishop on d1 can easily be captured by the king in the next move, and it's going to take a while for black to hunt down this knight in the corner. This, alongside the fact that white will have the bishop pair once these trades are all over, means that white would be better in this position, so it would be unwise for Eric to go into this line with bishop takes c2 and queen c5. So instead of all this, Eric decided to go knight d4 instead of bishop takes c2, so knight d4 in this position was played, and Magnus played queen c4 in response. Now this gets a little tricky because Eric has two options. Basically, he can play knight takes c2 or bishop takes c2 if he wants to win the c2 pawn. However, he actually chose to go for none of those options because both of them would be pretty risky, although it doesn't seem like it at first. So basically, if knight takes c2 is played, then white has the move knight b5, which would attack the queen on d6 and also attack the pawn on c7, so forking these two pieces. And once the pawn on c7 falls, then the king has to move and the rook on a8 will fall, so this would not be good for black at all. And instead of knight takes d4, if black plays the move bishop takes c2 here, there's actually a very strong move that would give white an advantage. However, it's not that easy to find. While watching this game live, I was considering moves like knight e4 and knight b5. However, there is one move that is stronger than both of these. If bishop takes c2 is played, the correct move would actually be knight g to e2. And the point is that if black decides to go for this exchange on d1, white can play knight takes d4, and then the bishop is trapped on d1, so white will get two pieces for the rook, and in this position that would be basically winning because it's a position where white can easily use their supply of minor pieces to attack the black king. If black takes the knight instead on e2, so if knight takes e2 is played, then you don't recapture the knight with any piece, you actually take on c2 with the king, because the knight is no longer defending the bishop on c2. And after this, black has to face the reality that they haven't really developed their pieces, so if something like knight takes c3 is played, d takes c3 will be the response, and note that white's king is already on the queen side, they have the open d file for the rook, their queen is nicely positioned, and they have the bishop pair, while black has really only developed their queen, and wherever the queen goes, say to g6, white can simply play bishop d3 and gambit the g2 pawn, because after queen takes g2, king b1, white's king is totally safe, and black's king has to face an onslaught of threats. For example, if castle's queenside, white can already play something like bishop f5 check, e6, and bishop takes e6. And then after f takes e6, queen takes e6, this rook is going to be lost, because, well, actually, you're just getting checkmated here with queen e8, so rook d8, queen takes d8. So this would be very bad for black, and you don't want to go into this. So Eric did not go into this, he played castles long instead, and here Magnus played knight e4. Knight e4 attacks the queen on d6 and opens up a discovered attack on the knight on d4. However, the knight is defended nicely at the moment, and Eric plays the move queen b6 in response. So keeping an eye on his knight on d4, which is defended by the rook and the queen, and Magnus plays knight e2 here, which increases the pressure on this knight. So Eric has to make a decision, and he chooses knight takes e2, bishop takes e2, e6, king b1, just some normal developing moves for both sides. Magnus gets his king to safety on the b1 square, while Eric is looking to develop the pieces on the king side that haven't been moved yet. Knight e7 is played, so either going to d5, c6, or f5, depending on what happens in the position. a4 by Magnus, so potentially looking to disrupt this queen with a move like a5 in the future, if you can defend that square. Knight c6 is played, so covering some of the key squares around the queen side, as well as looking at the center, potentially hopping into d4. Queen b5, so offering an exchange of queens. Magnus is an excellent endgame player, so trading the queens is something that he would welcome. Knight d4 is played, queen takes b6, a takes b6, and note that the bishop on e2 is under attack, so Magnus plays bishop c4. Bishop e7 by black, rook de1, just centralizing this rook on the semi-open e-file. Rook d7 is played, just staying solid, making sure to defend the bishop in case anything happens. Bishop c3, rook hd8, king b2, both sides still improving their position, c6, and b4. And at this moment, I thought that this configuration might be a little suspect for black because white really can easily maneuver his rooks to the a file and then potentially go a5 and then try and break open the queen side. And this is where I would think that white has some sort of advantage. I feel like this position is pretty level, and black is actually doing very well with their pieces. All centralized, it's not really clear where you can put your pieces, where they would be better than they already are. However, the one area where I think Magnus would have a slight pull here is the fact that he can easily push his pawns on the queen side and try and disrupt black's position over there. After b4, king c7 was played, rook a1, and e5. d3 by Magnus, f6, and b5. And after b5, it's clear that if black does nothing, then a5 will be a serious threat. Bishop f8 is played, rook hf1, knight f5, so still some maneuvering, and a5 was played in this position by Magnus. And this is already very dangerous for black, because if you open up this a5 to d8 diagonal, then note that the king on c7 and the rook on d8 are both on that diagonal, so black is in serious danger of losing an exchange in here. So c takes b5 was played, bishop takes b5, and rook d5 by Eric. Rook d5 basically accepts the loss of an exchange because after a takes b6, king takes b6, bishop a5 is a huge threat, and Magnus starts with bishop c4, so attacking this rook, and the rook can't remain on the 5th rank because c5 is covered by the knight, b5 is covered by the c4 bishop, and a5 is covered by the c3 bishop. So after bishop c4, if the rook were to move back along the d-file, then bishop a5 could be played, skewering the king to the rook and picking up an exchange. So after bishop c4, Eric chose to attack white's own rook by going knight e3, but after bishop takes d5, he's in no position to take the rook on f1 because bishop a5 would be a huge problem once again. So after bishop takes d5, black has to take with the rook takes d5, and now white can move their rook out of danger with the move rook b1. Rook b5 check is played, king c1, so getting ready to exchange black's last rook. Rook takes b1 is played, rook takes b1, and king c6. And here, Magnus is up an exchange. There are no pawns for it, so it's just a clean exchange, and someone of his caliber can very easily convert this. He starts with the move g3 because the knight on e3 was attacking the pawn on g2. After g3, black centralizes their knight with knight d5, but Magnus simply plays bishop d2, getting ready to mobilize his pieces and utilize his extra exchange to win the game. Bishop f7 was played, and here Magnus decides to kick the knight from d5, so he plays c4, and after knight c7 he finds the very precise move bishop a5. Seeing that there's no way to stop a move like rook b6 without playing something like knight a8, voluntarily putting your knight in the corner, Eric decides to throw in the towel here, and Magnus won the game. This game really highlights the dominance of Magnus even in this rapid time control because he's able to take down very strong grandmasters while using these bizarre lines with b3, f3, and e4. Doesn't really matter. His skills are enough to get it done almost every time, and this is no exception. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something. I'll be back with some more videos from the World Rapid and Blitz Championship, so stay tuned for those. Please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy them, and I'll see you guys in the next video.